So before we move into the content today, I want to start us off in a good way with an acknowledgement of the land that I'm on. So I'm located in Toronto, a word derived from Mohawk that means where the trees are standing in the water. Today, Toronto is covered under Treaty Number 13 and the Williams Treaties and is the traditional territory of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty made between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. As settlers, newcomers, refugees, and Indigenous people, we've all been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm mindful of the broken treaties that persist across Turtle Island today and recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in a meaningful and continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all of our relations. GCC is committed to advancing decolonization and anti-racism while centering the voices, leadership, and joy of Black, Indigenous, racialized, trans, and non-binary communities. While this work is underway, it's never over. It's informed by our approach to internal processes, to programming, to our philanthropic strategy, and the future we envision together. Today's session and the report that's at its heart reflect our commitment to an equitable and just climate transition. Next slide. Great. So we know that sustainable and climate-ready communities are needed, and we know that that need is urgent. For nearly 30 years, Green Communities Canada has connected and supported community organizations across the country to accelerate climate action. We're deeply focused not just on the why we should take climate action, but on the how. How do we make the momentous shifts that are needed in such a short period of time? How do we address the very real barriers that communities, and particularly marginalized communities, face to taking action? How do we ensure that our work is intersectional and inclusive? And how do we make these shifts last? Our programs are diverse and always transforming, but our goal remains the same. Invest in building local capacity needed to accelerate ambitious climate solutions. Next slide. Today, we support more than 50, in fact, nearly 100 organizations across the country, and together we drive equitable and transformative change, coast to coast to coast. We do this in a few ways: by providing a network for organizations to share resources and knowledge, by offering programming and services that organizations can roll out on the ground, and by funding the organizations that lead this vital work. Next slide. At GCC, our work focuses on 3 areas of climate impact: residential energy efficiency and the Energuide Service Organization, green infrastructure, and sustainable mobility. GCC has been a long-standing leader in promoting sustainable school mobility through research, advocacy, and training programs, supplemented with educational resources, collaborative partnerships, and knowledge exchange events just like this one. We were founding members of Canada Walks, Active School Travel Canada, and the Canada Active Transportation Network. These coalitions work closely with the Government of Canada to support the creation of Canada's first National Active Transportation Strategy and Fund. Next slide. In 2022, Green Communities Canada and Équiterre joined forces to launch the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance, or CESBA for short. The iconic yellow school buses that have been transporting children to school for nearly a century have generally been powered by fossil fuels. These buses are a significant part of Canada's transport sector, which overall contributes 25% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. The schools that put our children on the road to academic success should not diminish their chances at a bright and clean future. CESBA develops strategies and recommendations that accelerate the electrification of school buses across Canada. Our goal is for Canada's existing fleet of 51,000 school buses to be zero emissions by 2040. Next slide. CESBA membership is growing and includes research, advocacy, school, industry, and government organizations from coast to coast to coast. I want to offer my thanks to all of the CESBA members and to the members of our steering committee, Ecology Action Centre, Ecology Ottawa, For Our Kids, and Pollution Probe for your contributions to CESBA and to this report. Next slide. And before I pass it off to Nicole, who is our moderator for today, I want to offer my special thanks and gratitude to our funders. CESVA is made possible thanks to support from Balsam Foundation, McConnell Foundation, and especially Trottier Family Foundation, who's a national leader in this space. Thank you so much for making this work possible. It's really very much appreciated. So now I would like to hand things over to Nicole Roach, who is going to be our moderator for the day. Nicole, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Brianna, for the wonderful welcome. So for today, to present the highlights of this report, Embedding Equity in Canada's Transition to Electric School Buses, we are joined by three experts on sustainable mobility and equity issues who contributed to this report. So first we have Miriam Paunette. Miriam was previously one of our sustainable mobility leads at Green Communities Canada and is now in the role of Green Infrastructure Lead. She was the co-coordinator of CESVA from 2024 to 2025 and was the lead researcher on this equity report. Next, we have Henri Chevalier. Henri is a sustainable mobility advisor at Equiterre and was involved in the CESVA program since 2023. He contributed to the research, recommendations, and review of this report. And finally, we have Valerie Tremblay. Valerie is one of our sustainable mobility leads at Green Communities Canada, and she has been involved in coordinating the CESVA program since its inception in 2022 and was the lead author on this report. So today we are gathered to hear more about CESVA's recent report, Embedding Equity in Canada's Transition to Electric School Buses. The report dives into how the shift to electric school buses, so known as ESBs for short, can affect certain population groups throughout the 5 phases of their life cycle. So for this report, we've highlighted resource extraction, manufacturing, adoption, use, and disposal. So as you will hear from our speakers and panelists, each phase reveals unique challenges and opportunities for building a more inclusive transition. So I will now pass it on to Miriam, and she's going to start out by giving us an overview of the resource extraction process behind electric school buses.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. So as Nicole mentioned, I will be sharing a bit about the extraction phase of ESB production. ESBs rely on many materials, including lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper, sourced in Canada and around the world. The land in Canada is rich in many minerals used for ESB production. Notably, all of the priority minerals in Canada's critical minerals strategy are central to EV production, and Canada is the only Western nation with an abundance of those minerals. Next slide, please. Mining sites are generally located in rural and remote areas. They're also disproportionately located on or near Indigenous and community-managed lands. As well, they're often sourced from the global south to supply global north markets. Since these communities are burdened by the harmful impacts of mining, but are among the last to benefit from using ESBs, this makes for a very inequitable distribution of harms and benefits. Whether it's for fossil fuel powered buses or for electric buses, to varying degrees, extraction activities are associated with the following impacts. Mining projects contaminate or disrupt groundwater, expose and threaten protected habitats, they cause deforestation and air pollution. They create long-term threats of mine waste breaches and spills. They disrupt the local economy, including subsistence harvesting, commercial food production, and tourism. They cause social conflict at the local community level by polarizing community members. And they're tied to criminalization when community members are arrested for defending their territories. Economically, EV mining presents both challenges and opportunities for local communities. Mining can offer benefits, for example, employment opportunities or community benefit agreements with local governments. That said, public investments in mining infrastructure can also divert resources away from other needed essential services, and tax breaks reduce public revenue. Economic dynamics are also shaped by governance systems that often sideline Indigenous authority. For instance, Canada's free entry mining regime allows companies to stake claims with minimal consultation and frequently without full consent. In terms of impacts on workers, resource workers, especially women and immigrants, remain underrepresented and often face unsafe, precarious conditions in this industry. Union power is declining and job quality is uneven. As well, the influx of transient workers, often housed in temporary sites coined as man camps, are linked to increased rates of violence, harassment, and substance abuse in nearby communities, particularly affecting Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ plus people. Canadian mining companies are also very active internationally. Close to 50% of publicly listed mineral and mining exploration companies are Canadian, operating in over 100 countries, and the social and environmental impacts of mining are even more alarming outside of Canada. Canadian mining operations in Latin America, for example, divert water resources for lithium and copper extraction, exacerbating local shortages. As another example, mining in fragile ecosystems like the Paramos wetlands threaten climate regulation and drinking water sources. The Human Rights Council's UN Special Rapporteur highlights a pattern of human rights abuses by Canadian extractive industries operating abroad. The Canadian government and embassies are complicit in supporting mining projects that sidestep human rights and environmental protections. For example, Mining Watch Canada described instances of Canadian embassies publicly showing support for mining projects, in spite of the serious human rights complaints being filed and clear public opposition to the projects. Examples of this trend are prevalent across Latin America as well as Asia and Africa. There are many examples of Canadian government representatives colluding with governments in the Global South to pass legislation that lowers environmental standards and/or to fast-track projects without Indigenous or community consent. Next slide, please. This report's recommendations are that Canada must lead with equity-centered policy reform, calling for stronger environmental and social protections, including mandatory environmental justice impact assessments and Indigenous consent embedded in federal reviews. We recommend community benefit agreements that ensure Indigenous communities receive fair revenue, infrastructure, and training, and labor and human rights protections, both at home and abroad, through union support, due diligence laws, and empowering the Canadian Ombudsperson for responsible enterprise. In closing, in my research, the extraction industry emerged as the most concerning phase of the ESB life cycle. Community members and activists around the world have made it very clear that they don't want to be sacrifice zones for the EV industry. They are advocating for mining to be kept to a minimum, and that when it does need to take place, that the harms and benefits are equitably distributed and that social and environmental costs are minimized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. So now we're going to be going over the manufacturing side of the ESB value chain. So for the next slide, basically here, we're going to look at who assembles electric school buses and where are these manufacturing spots located. So Canada's ESB production is led by Lion Electric and Microbird, both based in Quebec. While Quebec dominates, there are also other players like Green Power Motor and US manufacturers such as IC Bus and Thomas Built Buses that also shape the North American market. So in terms of ESB manufacturing, we're talking about tens of thousands of jobs across materials processing, component production, and assembly. Next slide, please. So in terms of impact of school bus manufacturing jobs, so the clean transportation sector is booming. It's expected to support over 1.17 million jobs by 2026. But the shift to electric powertrains means fewer components and less assembly time. So that raises basically concerns about job losses and reduced labor hours. In terms of geographic distribution of these jobs, most ESB jobs are actually concentrated in Quebec and the US, leaving other Canadian regions behind. In terms of workforce barriers, there are also some of them, because, for example, older workers, those without formal training, and people in rural areas also face challenges accessing new roles. So you can maybe go back just to the former slide before. In terms of job quality, even unionized workers report low pay and instability. Lion Electric, for example, laid off 200 workers in 2024 due to delayed federal funding and, of course, other reasons that are related to the company, which basically highlights how dependent the sector is on government subsidies. For the next slide, we're basically going to share the CESBA's recommendations regarding the manufacturing sector. So Canada must ensure that the ESB transition is equitable and regionally inclusive. The way we can do it is by expanding Sustainable Jobs Training Fund to include EV manufacturing rules. We can also increase the number of partnerships with unions, colleges, and community groups to deliver inclusive training. And we also need to increase the collaboration with regional energy and resource tables to grow ESB manufacturing beyond Quebec by identifying, for example, industrial sites, labor pools, and infrastructure needs. And as a closing commentary, this discussion about manufacturing within CESBAD led us to publish an actual opinion piece in one of the Quebec media called Le Devoir. And in this opinion piece was an opportunity for us to highlight a crucial point. Canada's ESB industry cannot deliver stable, high-quality jobs if it depends on unstable public subsidies. The recent layoffs and the recent stories of financial turmoil at Lion Electric show that when order books rely too heavily on temporary funding, workers pay the price. So a sustainable electric bus strategy must go beyond short-term incentives. It needs to actually embrace long-term industrial planning, predictable funding, and clear labor standards. And by linking public investments to fair wages, training, and regional equity, Canada must turn the ESB transition into more than an environmental goal. It can make it a foundation for durable, good quality manufacturing jobs across the country. Now I'll pass it to Valérie for the adoption side.
Thank you, Henri. So for this section of the report, we tried looking at what does ESB adoption look across Canada and try to understand why there are some jurisdictions that have more electric school buses than others. So what we've seen is that obviously the adoption of ESBs is closely connected to government policies, targets, regulation, and funding initiative, which usually encourage ESB uptake by bridging the gap between the upfront cost of diesel buses and electric buses. So just as a reminder, the average price of electric school buses are between 400K and 600K, which is definitely higher than the cost of diesel buses, which is around 125K. Another factor that may weigh in on where buses are being adopted is the diversity in procurement models across provinces, which will also influence how incentives are applied. So, for example, in PEI, in Prince Edward Island, all school buses are provincially owned. So that will allow for more centralized decision making. In contrast, in Quebec and Ontario, they primarily rely on private contractors to operate their fleets, while in BC, it's school districts that are responsible for bus operation. And so, thanks to all of these different policy measures that are listed in the table on the right here, we see that BC, PEI, and Quebec are the leading provinces in terms of the total number of ESBs. They're also the only ones who have adopted, as we see in the table, some policy measures. And so, what we also see on the table on the left, though, is that there are no electric school buses in jurisdiction with large Indigenous population. My colleague Miriam will talk more about it later. But there are although some Indigenous communities, specifically in Quebec and BC, that have been early adopters in the ESB adoptions. So if we go to next slide, we also looked at the specific barriers different groups are facing in the adoption phase. So first, obviously, under-resourced school boards and districts, they can encounter equity concern with ESB adoption. The upfront cost of electric school buses is high, and it also requires investment in charging infrastructure. And these under-resourced boards and districts are sometimes already lacking the financial means for basic student transportation. They might also have competing priorities for funding, such as classroom funding and staff salaries. So it's kind of hard to expect of them to prioritize ESB adoption when there are so many other things they need to be tackling with. And it's kind of a similar picture for small fleet operators. Here, also, the high upfront cost of electric school buses is more difficult. They also need to be taking on the investment for charging infrastructure and training of their technicians and drivers. If they are small, they might also have a limited administrative capacity to submit submission to the government funding programs, and also manage the rerouting that needs to be done in order to adjust for the electric school buses range. And one last item that we see happening with smaller fleet operators is that as technologies like electric vehicles kind to tend to become the norm, the market will consolidate. And so many small operators will prefer to sell their fleet rather than make large investment in electrification. And this has a direct impact on the transportation costs. So if you have less and less numbers of operators, well, you're driving up transportation costs for school districts and reducing flexibility around that. So there are many equity issues we need to take into account, and I'll pass it on to my colleague Miriam, who will address the barriers that are specific to Indigenous communities and students with disabilities.
Thanks, Valérie. So in terms of students with disabilities, ESBs offer significant health benefits. Students with disabilities are more vulnerable to air pollution and often face longer commutes than their peers. And ESBs also produce less noise and vibration, which benefits students with sensory sensitivities. In spite of those benefits, access to ESBs is lagging behind for Canadian students with disabilities. Historically, Type A minibuses have been used for accessible transportation, but early electric models had limited range, making them unsuitable for long or cold weather routes. Newer models have now addressed this range issue, but supply remains limited and only a few ESB models are available in North America. The good news is that full-size buses can also be equipped with wheelchair lifts, expanding options for school districts. Making full-size buses accessible also means that students with disabilities can ride with their peers rather than being segregated on special buses. Students are advocating for this because it reduces social exclusion and allows them to more fully participate in school activities, for example, extracurricular outings. Students with disabilities are also advocating for buses to respond to a wider range of disabilities beyond wheelchair access and are bringing attention to risks of injury for children who are not being accommodated. For example, universal design features could provide solutions for students using canes or crutches. One student's testimony was that there's no solution for them to sit down on the wheelchair lift without having a wheelchair, which means they can either stand on the lift or walk up the steep stairs, both of which are unsafe options. As another example, an announcement or noise system would make quieter ESBs safer for students with vision disabilities. Students with disabilities face persistent barriers already on non-ESB buses. Many buses lack functioning wheelchair lifts, securement systems, or trained staff, and most ESBs offer no improvements in this regard. Without changes, ESBs risk reinforcing those existing inequities rather than addressing them. And for Indigenous communities, school transportation costs are nearly double those of provincial systems. Factors like remoteness, poor road conditions, and longer travel distances drive costs up as much as $115,000 annually per bus and make ESBs financially out of reach. Other barriers include limited federal funding. For example, while provinces like BC increased school bus budgets, Indigenous Services Canada, who supplies school bus funding for First Nation schools, did not. School staff in First Nation communities we interviewed also described juggling multiple roles, multitasking as principals, bus drivers, and teachers, which made it hard for them to find time to complete funding applications. Fleet sizes is another barrier. Many communities operate just one bus, meaning they lack a backup vehicle for repairs or replacement. And with longer wait times due to ESB repair services requiring specialized mechanics who are further away, this makes the transition unfeasible and also disqualifies them from some funding programs. Infrastructure gaps is another barrier. Cold climates and lack of charging stations, especially in remote communities, make ESB adoption unsafe, impractical, or impossible. Road conditions are another major concern. Many Indigenous and remote communities contend with unpaved roads that accelerate wear and tear on vehicles. An example would be buses frequently sustaining damage from mud and potholes, leading to cracked headlights, loose windows, and increased maintenance costs, issues that worsen in poor weather. And finally, energy access is another critical barrier. Over 170 Indigenous communities are off-grid and don't benefit from energy projects on their lands. Even where electrical services exist, limited grid capacity and the high cost of upgrades for level 3 chargers pose significant challenges. Competing infrastructure priorities and concerns about power outages further discourage investment in ESBs. So our next slide, please. Our recommendations for adoption are to expand accessible ESB models and mandate universal design features in all new buses, to revise federal funding criteria to reflect the realities of Indigenous communities, to create a dedicated Indigenous funding stream modeled after ZETI VIP and provide grant writing support, and to prioritize funding for pollution-burdened and underserved areas using air quality and census data to target high priority zones. Thank you, and I will now pass things back to Henri, who will be speaking to use.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Miriam. So in terms of use, we can ask ourselves the question, how does the use of electric school buses compare with that of internal combustion engine school buses, like the conventional school buses? When it comes to charging needs, electric school buses require dedicated charging infrastructure. We talk about level 2 chargers, level 3. Level 2 chargers are basically slower but cheaper, and level 3 chargers are faster but costly. And this basically affects where buses are parked and how routes are planned. In terms of range, there are some limitations with electric school buses. ESBs, for example, can typically travel 100 to 300 kilometers per charge, depending, of course, on the terrain, on the weather, and the battery age. So this requires careful route design, and sometimes it can limit flexibility for longer trips. And in terms of depot parking, unlike diesel buses, electric school buses are usually parked at depots for overnight charging, which can disrupt certain rural practices, especially among drivers who park buses at home. So for the next slide, we're going to look at the impacts that it has on school transportation staff and students. In terms of context, it's important to understand that Canada faces a driver shortage, only 40,000 drivers for 2.2 million students. And usually low wages, part-time hours, and stressful conditions are usually key contributors to this driver shortage. So in terms of electric school buses, we know that they are going to bring some health benefits to the drivers because they would eliminate the diesel fumes and reduce noise and vibration. One of the key aspects of electric school buses is that the range limitations can sometimes restrict access to overtime shifts, such as field trips for certain drivers, which can reduce the income for some of them. In terms of other impacts that it can have on the school transportation staff and especially drivers is the increase of commute travel time and cost. The requirement for electric school buses to be charged overnight at in certain regions, to be charged overnight at depots, can create some challenges for rural drivers who often park their buses at home due to the distance from depot. So this shift can basically increase travel time, like commute travel time and cost, potentially limiting job opportunities and deepening existing inequities for rural drivers. But in certain regions, like in Prince Edward Island and Quebec, there is actually home-based charging pilots that offer flexibility to drivers, decreasing commute time and cost and avoiding inequities for rural drivers. So there are solutions for this. In terms of electric school buses, when we deploy more of them, we can reduce the maintenance work hours, which can be a good thing, but this transition by reducing maintenance work hours can actually decrease some of the job security for traditional mechanics due to fewer moving parts, and especially because of the fact that electric school buses bring also the issue of the fact that repairs are basically controlled by manufacturing companies. So in this context, the manufacturing controlled repairs can sideline local fleet mechanics, raising concerns about workforce displacement. But we also have a high need for high voltage electrical skills for school transportation staff in the electric school bus adoption, but training opportunities still remain limited, hindering a fair workforce transition. So in terms of impacts on the students, how does it impact the students? Well, first, the health benefits are crucial here. Electric school buses eliminate diesel emissions, which contain carcinogens linked to asthma, heart disease, and cognitive issues. Students with disabilities are twice as likely to develop asthma and often face longer commute. In terms of electric school buses, they can also reduce noise and vibration, which benefits students with especially sensory sensitivities. And in this case, quieter rides have been shown to improve comfort, reduce overstimulation, and support mental health. In terms of electric school bus allocation across the country, there's a lack of equity because despite the benefits that it brings, routing decisions rarely prioritize equity. Lower income areas often are more exposed to pollution, and sometimes they may not receive electric school buses because of the funding for the school district. In terms of accessibility features, many electric school buses still lack accessibility features like functioning wheelchair lift or securement systems. Specialized transportation can also reinforce social exclusion by, for example, segregating students with disabilities. So in the next slides, basically the CESBA's recommendations on this particular aspect of the use of electric school buses. Well, first, we are calling to increase school transportation funding to raise wages and offset income loss from reduced extra shifts caused by the range limitation of electric school buses. We're also encouraging living wage certification for school boards and operators, as seen in Vancouver. We're pushing for the use of the Sustainable Jobs Training Fund and Canada Job Grants to train mechanics in EV systems. We're also calling to modernize apprenticeship programs to include ESB specific skills. We're also pushing to include repair access clauses in procurement contracts to prevent manufacturer lock-in. And we're also calling to update procurement guidelines to support a wider range of accessible models. And as a closing commentary on this specific aspect of use in this report, CESBA is going to continue working on that specific aspects because the next phase of this work is actually underway. For our next research that will be released in 2026, we're basically building a comprehensive picture of workforce conditions in Canada's school bus sector as electrification advances. And our main concern in that future research that will be released next year is that precarious employment, which is characterized by low wages, limited benefits, and unpaid training, will remain a structural barrier to a successful and equitable electric school bus transition. Because labor shortages and service disruptions already strain a school transportation system, which make it difficult for it to prioritize electrification. And so without improving job quality and providing accessible training opportunities, expecting workers to upskill and adapt to electric school bus technologies will remain unrealistic or at least difficult, and Canada's electrification goals will remain out of reach. So now from now on, I'll pass it to Valérie to talk more about the disposal section of the report.
Thank you, Henri. So I've put here on the slide a few key stats I think there are to know about the end of life phase of school buses. So first thing we should know is that buses in Canada, whether they are diesel, propane, or electric, they have a legal lifetime of 12 years. This can sometimes vary from a province to another, but usually that's the average lifetime. The fleet of Canada school buses is relatively new, so 45% of school buses are under 5 years old. And on the other side, we have a 22% share that are over 10 years old. So we have kind of a significant share of the fleet that is nearing retirement. So while there is this 12 years number, when we look at electric buses, their batteries will need to be replaced before that time. So usually between 8 and 10 years of use. But even if batteries can no longer be used within a vehicle, they can be repurposed for other applications such as energy storage or be recycled to recover the critical minerals that are inside the battery and then be reintegrated in the supply chain. What we see in Canada is that we have many companies that are engaged in battery recycling. So we have Lithium Technologies, Electra Battery Material, Life Cycle. We have many more, but this is just some of the few. But despite this presence of different industry here, there is currently no federal or provincial regulatory framework that is governing ESB battery disposal. In the past years, there were proposed extended producer responsibility policies that were initiated in BC and Quebec, but they were ultimately withdrawn. And so right now, nationally, the only initiative we see is the EV battery recovery program that was launched in 2023 by manufacturers. So that includes Lion Electric, but not all electric school bus manufacturers. So since it's voluntary, not all of them needs to be implicated in it. And we kind of see a similar regulatory vacuum for diesel buses disposal. So there's same thing here. There's no national policy for what happens with diesel buses once they're being replaced or phased out by electric school buses. And so disposal practices, as we can see on this graph on the right from WRI, the World Resources Institute, that the practices will vary. It can include scrapping, recycling, dealership trade-ins, public auctions, and in very rare instances, conversion to electric drivetrain. If we go to the next slide, we tried looking at how school bus disposal practices can impact certain groups. I have to say, it was very difficult to find information on this. Thankfully, our friends at WR had already did the work for the US, so we just needed to adjust some of it for the Canadian context. But what we see is that in most cases, ESB batteries will be sent to recycling facilities. But when you look at where those recycling facilities are located, most of them will operate near low-income and racialized communities who are in most cases already facing poor air quality, traffic, and noise. And so if you don't have strong oversight as to what happens around those recycling facilities, we could say that battery processing could worsen these conditions. And in the rarer instances where batteries are not recycled, they might be improperly stored or dumped, which can cause fire, chemical, and pollution risk. And we see that these risks often fall on low-income and Indigenous communities in Canada because the enforcement around illegal dumping will be weaker compared to more affluent areas. And so I think similarly to resource extraction, so there are equity concerns here, but obviously what happens here is often impacting what happens in other countries. So what we're seeing is that more and more retired buses, diesel buses, will be exported to communities in the global south. And so as we retire more and more of these buses, the ones that are updated, very polluting, will be exported in countries where there is less, where there are weaker air quality and vehicle safety standards. And so we're kind of shifting the environmental and health burden onto already disadvantaged population, where the use of high emission buses will continue contributing to poor air quality and health issues. And another related issue is that if we keep exporting or polluting an old technology vehicle to these countries, they might become reliant on those obsolete technologies without having the resources to transition to zero emission alternative like we have the chance here to do. And if we look at the recommendation, I think the recommendation as to how to embed equity at this last stage of the ESB transition are like pretty realistic. The first one, and that's something we're starting to see just last year, there was a pilot project in Manitoba. So we think that one alternative that we don't hear a lot about is the use of repowered school buses. So right now, it's not something that can be done legally in Canada, but we want to push Transport Canada to enable the safe and legal use of diesel buses that are being converted to electric. So that will not only reduce the price of electric school buses, but most importantly, it will reduce the environmental impact of scrapping thermal buses and extracting new materials for new vehicles. The next recommendation, we think is something that Transport Canada could do with Global Affair Canada, is to regulate the export of decommissioned buses so that we reduce the shift of pollution burden to Global South countries. If you're wondering what else could happen to diesel buses that were retiring, so the legal lifetime is for buses to be used for student transportation, but that doesn't mean the buses can no longer be used on the route. It can be used for another type of use. So we could still be using them and making some adjustments so that they're less polluting. instead of exporting them to other countries. And finally, something that BC and Quebec were on the edge of doing, but finally didn't do, was adopting extended producer responsibility policies for EV battery. This will basically hold a manufacturer accountable for electric school buses they are selling, and it will make them responsible for collecting and recycling the batteries in the vehicle. So obviously, like EV batteries, ESB batteries are very valuable. So we doubt that they will end up in landfills and not be recycled or repurposed. And ESB are also a new technology, so we don't know exactly how long they can actually last beyond the legal lifetime of 12 years. Right now, their legal lifetime are set as the same as a diesel one, but maybe throughout the years, this length will be changed for ESB. But with EV technology becoming more and more popular, we can just hope that government will adopt a framework to regulate their end of life so that no community will be disproportionately impacted by their disposal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie and Henri and Miriam. We got through a ton of content. Thank you so much. So now we will move to questions. So we've had a few in the chat, and then I also see a few popped into the Q&A section. So just a reminder, if you do have questions, please add them to the Q&A function. So at the bottom of your screen, there's the chat, and there's also the Q&A. So please add your questions. We're eager to answer them. So first off, we'll start with Stefan or Stephen. So they said, I'm interested in how to help our customers to obtain the funds for electrifying the school bus fleet. They also noted that they are based in Ontario. Henri, I saw that you already provided a bit of guidance, but did you or anyone else want to share some available funding sources for operators in Canada and more specifically in Ontario?
Well, the issue is that there's no provincial funding for electric school buses in Ontario. So I would probably rely on the Zero Emission Transit Fund and Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. But if Miriam or Valérie has more information, feel free to share it.
Yeah, I think the fact that there's absolutely no provincial incentive in Ontario is very hard for fleet operators in the province. I think right now the Zero Emission Transit Fund has ended as it's been oversubscribed. So we're kind of waiting to see when the next round of funding will be announced. This time it will be through the Canada Public Transit Fund. We don't know exactly how much will be set aside for that particular program. We don't know if the funding criteria and eligibility will be the same as well. But we're hoping to see more and more Ontario fleet operators accessing that program, as Ontario is the largest fleet of school buses across the country. So we think that's where there are the more gains to make.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. We'll move next to a question from Robin. From what I can see, the Sustainable Jobs Training Fund ended May 15th, 2024. Is it expected to start up again? Additionally, we have installed 15, 20 kilowatt chargers to help address range concerns. Was this considered as a solution to improve range? So maybe since it's a two-part question, Henri or Valerie, would you be able to speak to the Sustainable Jobs Training Fund?
So I checked for the fund, for the actual fund that Robin is talking about. It's true that the fund ended May 15, 2024, but apparently the fund is part of a long-term initiative with a total allocation of up to $99 million for projects from 2024 to 2025. So basically, that suggests that probably additional funding rounds may occur in the future, from my understanding. But from what I see, there hasn't been like a government announcement about the next round. So maybe we would have to be more patient regarding that. But for the 1,520 kilowatt chargers, we haven't necessarily talked about it, but actually, I would be interested to hear more news about you about this from you, Robin. So if you want, you can always email us maybe more information about that specific type of chargers, so that we can actually update a few things on our side, so that we're up to date according to the technological advancement. So you can email us. You can email me. My email address, I can put it in my chat in the chat to help you out. But if there's any extra answer from my colleague about the chargers or anything else, feel free.
I think similar to the Canada Public Transit Fund, so there will be a new budget announced next month. So I think we're looking forward at seeing if more funding will be set aside for zero emission transit fund and also the Canada Sustainable Training Fund. But thanks, Ahi, for your reply.
Okay, yeah, the 120 kilowatt charge. Okay, I was very surprised by the amount of number, but now it makes sense. Thank you, Robin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our next question, submitted by Arij. It's a bit of a two-parter, so I'm going to separate it into two questions. So first one, given the significant barriers to ESB adoption, specifically the lack of local manufacturing, high costs, and trade tariffs, is ESB procurement still a realistic advocacy goal, or should it be advocating for local manufacturing and diverse trade options? It's a big question.
I mean, I think we can do both, in the sense that we could advocate for ESB procurement, but while still advocating for local manufacturing, and that has been the purpose of our opinion piece that was released in Le Devoir in February or April this year. I have a terrible memory when it comes to dates, but it's important to advocate for that local manufacturing, because we know that we're living economic nationalism times with rising tariffs and protectionism. So in order to make sure that our ESB industry manufacturing potential is actually protecting our economic sovereignty, we have to make sure that it's actually within the bounds of local manufacturing in this sense. So I think it's important to talk about both, and to reinforce the fact, and it's also important to also remind ourselves that the internal combustion engine side is not good as well, in terms of not just the pollution, but it's also the lack of economic sovereignty. Because most of the internal combustion engine buses are from the United States. So we know that electric school bus manufacturing is not only an opportunity, but probably the only opportunity to actually boost local manufacturing in Canada to protect economic sovereignty. But maybe the second question, I can leave it to my peers, so I don't feel inspiration here.
Great, thank you so much. Or go ahead, Valerie.
Yeah, the second question is very interesting because like even the city where I'm from, or some in Montreal where I'm based right now, I see this dual model where some schools will use student transportation like through like the yellow traditional buses, and sometimes you will have dedicated transit bus for the school specifically. And that was the case when I was young as well. Like there was one school I went to that it was exclusively transit buses, and one was a yellow school buses. I'd be very interested in knowing why this decision was made, like what influenced one model over another. Is it more cost effective to go with transit bus, or is it not? Because I would imagine they have a similar capacity. Maybe even school buses would have more. I feel like they're longer and have more seating capacity. But yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'd be really interested in, I don't know, meeting with school districts that have made the decision to go with transit instead of school buses. And I think, like you said, municipality now, like I think many across Canada, are obligated to replace their all transit buses with electric ones. And I think in this case, there are more government funding available for that, whereas for electric school buses, there are less funding. So that could be one way of like accelerating the electrification of the way students are being transported. Because I think at the end of the day, it's not um, it doesn't have to be school buses specifically. It's really the mode of transportation for students, since they're the one being carrying with those buses all day, twice a day, and are inhaling the pollution from the buses. So if these buses are electric but transit, I think that at the end of the day, that's what should be done. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Arish.
Thank you, Valerie. So I'll just flag that what Henri was speaking about with the Le Devoir article, that's been linked in the chat if anyone wants to check that out. And then the second question that was asked, just for context to what Valerie was speaking to there, is what does the panel think about pivoting efforts like Europe toward promoting school to municipality partnerships that expand electric public transit access for students? So very interesting topic. If any of the other panelists wanted to speak to that question.
I think Valerie said most of it.
Super. Then we'll jump to the next question. And I'm going to look to Miriam to answer this one. So what did you find to be the most surprising or challenging thing when researching this for this report or this topic in particular?
The most surprising? Oh. Well, I had mentioned earlier that probably the topic that impacted me the most in my research was the extraction industry. And I was quite impressed with the amount of information that's available. There are advocacy organizations, Mining Watch Canada is one of them, that have excellent resources to provide information on what's happening in Canada and also internationally. Specifically in relation to Canadian mining companies. So I thought that was great, seeing as there are areas of the ESB life cycle where we are lacking information in contrast. And I guess another piece that I found particularly interesting were the amazing ideas, the innovative ideas that students with disabilities have for how to provide universal design features. I mentioned a couple of them in my presentation, but they had so many suggestions that I think should be adopted to make buses more safe and accessible for a wide range of needs.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing, Miriam. Next up, folks are curious if there were any research gaps or things that weren't able to be covered in this report. So maybe Valerie, you could speak to some of those gaps, and then Henri, maybe you can give a preview for some of the research that is still to come that people should be looking out for in the next few months.
Yes. Well, I think one of the biggest limit of the report was that, yes, we were able to look at the life cycle of electric school buses, but weren't able to compare it to the life cycle of a diesel school bus. I think at this point in research, we have been able to do this life cycle comparison of a gas vehicle with an electric vehicle, although the results are already being debated. But for electric school buses, we're not there yet. So that information we couldn't find. And I think it would have taken us like years to add that component into our research. So obviously, when you look at the report, it might look like we're only criticizing electric school buses. But just bear in mind that we just didn't have the capacity to take into account the impacts of the diesel school bus life cycle, which you can imagine are, I would say, like more impactful than electric school buses. just when you take into account the environmental and health impacts. So I think that was a limit to our research. So I think our research doing that comparison could be very interesting. And one thing that might interest people to know is that there's no one source of information about where electric school buses are located across Canada. Like for us, it's really looking at different announcements that are being made in like local journals, reaching out to some government stakeholders that throughout the country. But like Transport Canada doesn't seem to have an accessible database of electric school buses available. So we don't know where they are. So it's just information we get here and there. So yeah, I think we would be looking at putting that together in the future. But yeah, maybe Avi, if you want to add more onto the research gap.
Yeah, so as we talked about that future research that is going to be basically focused on building a comprehensive portrait of the workforce conditions and challenges in ESB adoption in Canada, because some of the research gaps, and that's the reason why our future research is trying to respond to one of the identified research gaps in this research is for example, about the impact, the clear impact of electrification on small and medium enterprises. That's very important because we're hearing a lot of rumors, we're hearing a lot of things about the fact that there are some tons of small medium enterprises that are just putting an end to their activities because of the high cost of electrification, but we don't fully know the scope of that and the gravity of that issue. So that's the reason why we want to do that research is, by example, by not just talking to different stakeholders and small, medium enterprises that are going through tough times through that electrification. We're also building a survey to share it with well, at least a good portion of Quebec-based transporters, operators, school bus operators, to actually understand what has been the impact of electrification on their profit margin, on their operational expenses. How do they see the future of electrification within their own school bus transportation area? How do they actually see it in terms of risk for their operational viability in the next years? So these are things that are going to be important in this research. And the other aspect of the research that we're going to be releasing next year is the fact that electrification brings new skill requirements, especially for drivers and especially for mechanics. But unfortunately, training programs across the country are still fragmented, they're still inadequate or simply missing. So in this case, there's no coordinated strategy to ensure that workforce readiness for the ESB transition. So we want to, through that research, build a pan-Canadian portrait of requalification efforts across the nation to understand what exists in each province and identify the major gaps so that we can talk about it to political staff, to bureaucrats in different ministries so that we can push for it.
Thank you so much. Well, that concludes for today. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for all of their work on the research and in publishing this really, really important and impactful report. So I will hand it over to Brianna for some quick closing remarks.
Okay, thanks so much, Nicole. And thank you to Valerie, to Henri, and to Miriam for your really thoughtful presentations and your attention to all the questions. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that everybody on the webinar did as well. So just to reiterate what Nicole said, many thanks to the presenters for their work and the generosity, and thanks to everybody who joined us today. Just a reminder that you can look for the follow-up survey and emails with resources. That'll be coming out soon. And to keep your eye out for our next Voices for Action event. Our next webinar will be coming up in a month in November. So thank you again. And I look forward to seeing everybody at future events.
Thank you.
Thank you.